take you now to the other part of this hall. That's where bilateral meetings are currently taking place. I do believe President Cyril Ramaphosa is on the podium. Let's listen in to that discussion.
Foundations of a more resilient and secure multilateral trading system. To be clear, building a new global economic architecture will require significant effort and considerable political will. Multiple efforts are already underway, as I described just now. The G20 can and should play a key leadership role in coordinating these efforts, and Singapore stands ready to do our part and work with all members towards this objective. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Wong. I now move on and request His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Mr. Phang Minh Chinh, to take the floor.
Thưa ngài Phú Hoa Sa, thưa các nhà lãnh đạo và quý vị đại biểu, tôi xin chúc mừng ngài Tổng thống và chính phủ Nam Phi đã đảm nhận vai trò Chủ tịch G20 năm 2015 và đánh giá cao chủ đề đoàn kết, bình đẳng, phát triển bền vững. Thế giới đang trải qua những thay đổi sâu sắc mang tính thời đại. Nhiều vấn đề chưa có tiền lệ mang tính toàn dân, toàn diện và toàn cầu. Trong bối cảnh đó, quản trị toàn cầu cần hướng tới mục tiêu trọng tâm là duy trì hòa bình, ổn định và phát triển bao trùm toàn diện. Nguyên tắc quan trọng nhất là tôn trọng, bình đẳng, cùng có lợi dựa trên luật lệ và thông lệ quốc tế. Đoàn kết, hợp tác, đối thoại nhằm tạo ra sức mạnh, đem lại lợi ích, củng cố niềm tin. Cách tiếp cận xuyên suốt là toàn dân, toàn diện, toàn cầu, đặt con người ở vị trí trung tâm. Với phương châm đoàn kết để có sức mạnh, hợp tác để có lợi ích, đối thoại để có lòng tin, tôi xin đề xuất G20 thúc đẩy 3 cái đảm bảo chiến lược sau đây. Một là đảm bảo ổn định để phát triển trong quan hệ quốc tế, chính trị, thế giới và kinh tế vĩ mô toàn cầu. G20 cần đi đầu xây dựng cơ chế
in building mechanism for international cooperation through mutual respect and it needs to seek suitable solutions to conflict and creating conducive environment for development. It should coordinate policies to ward off systemic risk and respond to crisis. It should keep trade barriers down, minimize the supply chain fragmentation, spur suitable debt transformation initiatives, and ensure global macro stability. Second, guarantee for the rule-based multilateral trading system centered around the WTO and a balanced, transparent, and open global financial system, and for equal access to science, technology, digitalization, and development financing. I call on G20 to step up cooperation and resist politicization of science and trade to assist developing countries through fair trade policies that harmonize benefits and to support development of effective financial system and the enhancement of their digitalization capability to better meet the needs and for rapid, sustainable development of states. The comprehensive reform of the WTO should be also driven to enhance its operation. Third, to guarantee the flexible and effective system of the global governance to bring about the ecosystem necessary to leap ahead in the era of digitalization and green translation, I count on the G20 and multilateral institution to advance dialogue and build a framework for governance that would keep the harmony between economic, social, and environmental concerns, between the present and the future, between the interests of the economies, and drive cooperation in AI, climate change, and disaster and epidemic response. Ladies and gentlemen, The quote of the late President Nelson Mandela, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest." Vietnam stands ready to work together with the G20 members and the international community for a world of peace, civilization, prosperity, sustainable and inclusive development that leaves no one behind, so that all people may benefit from the fruit of development and international integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now call upon His Excellency Mr. Sophie, Prime Minister of the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria, to take the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس سيريل رامافوزا. اسمحوا لي أولا أن أنقل إليكم تحيات رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون الذي شرفني بإلقاء الكلمة التي يوجهها لهذه القمة. هذا نصها: فخامة الرئيس سيريل رامافوزا رئيس جمهورية جنوب أفريقيا، أصحاب الفخامة رؤساء الدول والحكومات، السيدات والسادة الحضور الكريم، يسعدني بداية أن أعرب عن خالص شكري لفخامة الرئيس سيريل رامافوزا على دعوته الكريمة لبلدي للمشاركة في هذه القمة الهامة التي نفخر بانعقادها لأول مرة في أرض إفريقية، مشيداً عالياً بالأولويات والمواضيع المقترحة خلال جلساتها، بما يعكس إدراكاً ووعياً كبيرين بحجم التحديات المعقدة التي تواجه عالمنا اليوم على الصعيدين السياسي الاقتصادي، وتؤثر أيما تأثير على التجانس العالمي إن لم يتم التكفل بها بشكل جدي جماعي وسريع. السيد الرئيس، فيما يخص الأولويات المطروحة على طاولة اجتماعنا هذا، اسمحوا لي بالتطرق إلى النقاط التالية. أولاً، تجدد الجزائر الدعوة إلى معالجة عاجلة لمسألة ثقل المديونية وخدماتها على الدول النامية والأكثر فقراً من خلال مقاربة تتضمن مسح جانب منها أو تحويلها إلى استثمارات مباشرة.
All right, well, let's step out of those discussions. Of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa chairing that particular meeting. It is day one of the Leaders G20 Summit, and already early days, early hours, we have a declaration. First time on the African soil, centered around key South African themes of solidarity, equality, as well as sustainability. And I'm joined now just to unpack some of the day's developments. And I mean, we've had a number of breaking news stories for you today. I'm joined by our correspondent, specialist international news, Sophie Mokoena, as well as Dr. Lebohang Pheko, who's a political economist. Thank you so much to you both. Sophie, I'm going to start with you. I mean, we were listening to President Cyril Ramaphosa's opening remarks during the summit, and towards the end of those remarks, that's when he announced that the declaration has been adopted by the nations. I mean, it did come as a surprise. I mean, just speak to us about that moment and, of course, the confirmations that came afterwards from Durko.
Well, many of us, we were expecting that will happen tomorrow on the last day of the summit.
Yeah.
And it happened during the opening. But when you follow what has been happening this week, we know that yesterday we ran a story that the Sherpas have agreed on a declaration. And therefore it was now up to heads of state and government to either adopt or make changes or reject it. But the Sherpas are delegated by their respective countries to negotiate. So they constantly speak to the senior leaders or politicians in terms of ensuring that they don't agree to something that's likely going to compromise their countries. And therefore, the adoption of the declaration by the Sherpas, it was an indication that there is progress and it's a matter of formality. As we often say that the Leaders' Summit is more ceremonial. They use the platform and the event or the gathering more on bilateral talks to interact on serious stuff. But a lot of work is being done by the Sherpas, starting from when you receive that authority to be, as a country, the presidency of the G20. So, to be honest, we expected a declaration, perhaps not quite early, but also we spoke to some of the people who have been involved since January, after South Africa started its presidency. President Ramaphosa spoke to a number of very powerful nations within the G20. He started there. So we saw him, shuttling in and out of the country, engaging. He used those opportunities, or those meetings where he was sometimes invited, not really participating, to start working on ensuring that come November, Africa is able to deliver and make history. And therefore a country, France, played a prominent role in assisting. A country, the United Kingdom, did that, including the chair of the G7, that is Canada. So there was a heavy, heavy political lobbying. And of course, the ambassador, then the Sue Sherpa and the Sherpa, including the minister, working very hard at the level of negotiation.
And I appreciate that comprehensive explanation, because I think what it does also speak to is a lot of the things that have not been said. So we've been seeing a lot of negotiation behind the scenes, but not quite sure what it is. But Dr. Pheko, maybe let's come in there from what Sophie has been saying, in a sense of when you look at some of the the ideals or the policies that South Africa has been pushing on multilateralism, on peace and security, and supporting developing nations. How important is it, and significant actually, is it for this declaration? As Sophie said, we expected it tomorrow, but it came on the first day of the meeting, in fact, in President Cyril Ramaphosa's address.
And he said so early this morning, as he was opening, that the declaration was effectively ready. I don't know if that was supposed to be for our ears. And here we are. And I think it illustrates the level of I think the consensus that has been built behind the scenes in the absence of, certain parties in certain countries. It also illustrates that multilateralism is alive and well, particularly at a time when we're living in a multipolar world. There is obviously an understanding that power doesn't reside with one country, and it certainly multilateralism is moving from your traditional hegemons. Multilateralism and power are not only about economic size. That's the other thing. Size is not necessarily might. There is cultural diplomacy. There are people who are very influential in the context of, for example, their military expertise. In a country like Turkey, that's played a crucial and sometimes problematic role in recent years around the Ukraine-Russia skirmish, as it were. So we have different poles of power that are emerging. Japan should not be seen as a spent force, for example. Countries like, China is very obvious. India still has its own aspirations to be certainly at least a sub-regional and a global superpower. And I also think that South Africa, let's not forget that South Africa has led the global charge against Israel at the international courts. That was a huge event and continues to reverberate. It has taken our international standing to quite a high level that we don't appreciate sufficiently in this country. So we might not have the biggest economy, but in terms of our voice and our global influence, there is no doubt that there are multiple poles. And I think also what this declaration speaks to is the this declaration also makes some of those aspirations very clear around sovereignty, for example, cooperation, and so forth.
Dr. Pheko, I mean, I'll keep on looking at my phone because we are expecting a bilateral agreement meeting of sorts with the Chancellor of Germany as well as President Cyril Ramaphosa. And I mean, we've been seeing, as Sophie has also indicated earlier on, these bilateral discussions between President Cyril Ramaphosa as well as other countries. Quite prominently, we saw with the EU,
European Union.
It was a significant one too, on the first, in fact, 2 days before the actual summit. What can we expect about this one with Germany, and how significant is the relationship between South Africa and Germany?
Well, remember that Germany is, other than the European Union, is one of the largest economies in the world. With the pivot away from centering one particular economy in North America, we've also been able to remind ourselves that we do have many other friends. It is a important, historically a very stable ally, a stable partner, quite neutral in the areas that matter. And it also illustrates yet again that this whole fixation on particular political geographies and economic geographies has been to the detriment of the world. One of the opportunities that's emerged from the tariff wars or the tariff tantrums, as it were, has been the opportunity to look east, to look north, to look inwardly, to look within the continent, for example, and to remind ourselves that there are several other options and several other communities of development that we can always look to.
Yeah. Sophie, I want to pick up on the theme of solidarity in crisis. I mean, you mentioned the Western power that we are not going to be mentioning, but we've seen a number of news today just basically cementing that decision by South Africa that, in fact, it cannot allow a delegation of the United States for the handover ceremony because it would be breaking certain protocols in as far as the G20 is concerned. Just speak to us about the dynamics around that matter.
Remember, the United States of America, they wanted the attaché at the embassy here and some officials to attend and the attaché to receive the, ceremonial, whatever they are handing over. But then you have to speak and make a statement. Now, in terms of protocol, this is a summit of leaders, and therefore, when you bring an attaché, not even an ambassador, even though we know that he's the most senior person at the embassy. For South Africa, President of the Republic of South Africa, handing over to a diplomatic official, a diplomat, it didn't sit well with South Africa. And therefore, because this is a diplomat, the handing over is going to happen at Derco next week. And I can guarantee you it will be a diplomat, a junior diplomat. It's not going to be a minister, I'm sure, or the president. And therefore, that speaks to those issues of a protocol. However, we still have to get a reaction from the United States of America, whether they will go to Derco and be part of those formalities. We may see a situation where President Trump give instruction that they shouldn't go to receive. It's now America next year, so it makes no difference. And he did indicate that he's going to start from scratch. He's going to do away with lots of things. This thing is too broad, and he's just going to focus on economic matters as part of the mandate of the G20 when it was established at ministerial level. So let's wait for the Truth Social, Trump posting there, and of course, it will go viral.
Sophie, I know that we've been working here pretty much the whole week. Our phones die, batteries die. I'm going to hand you my iPad so that you can have line of sight of that declaration as we speak about it, Dr. Pheko. Dr. Pheko. And Dr. Pheko, I mean, when we look at just some of the issues that were raised by South Africa in the 133 meetings that we've been seeing since South Africa took its G20 presidency on the 1st of December 2024, one of the key issues was disaster and climate resilience. But there's no way we can talk about that without talking about funding, which is quite crucial, especially when you consider from a debt perspective that most of the developing countries are spending so much money servicing that debt as opposed to concentrating on the key issues like resilience in terms of disaster management, climate resilience, etc. Just your understanding and appreciation of that. I mean, the UN Secretary General yesterday talked about political will. He said some of these key issues can be eradicated or can at least be addressed if countries really had that political will.
So there are a number of interesting controversies around climate resilience and around the financialization of climate debt and the climate debt swaps as well. Debt for climate swaps, which are really problematic because what they do is to really push the can further down the road, and it's a circularizing of an inherently problematic and toxic debt model. What it also is incredibly ahistorical, and a lot of critics have said that that we shouldn't, as African countries and as countries of the majority world, be expected to share the same culpability for climate degradation as the countries of the minority world, the global north. And that has been, behind closed doors, one of the deep concerns as well. Another deep concern is that even what is being called a just transition is really an embedding of the current status quo. And in fact, it's a way of really continuing to harness global south resources, land, etc. We have already seen land invasions, land renting that's taking place on the continent in the name of trying to deal with climate degradation and even beginning to depopulate parts of the continent. And I think these are things that we need to keep a very strong eye on, because in the absence of a historical lens on how the climate became so degraded in the first place, it's also in the context of historic industrialization and production mechanisms over the last 200 years, which have brought the planet to this point. So this whole notion of we need to save the planet, we need to all do our part to become more climate resilient. And lastly, even the terminology of resilience is also very corporatized. There are people who are talking more about climate flexibility, climate adaptability, and appreciating that it cannot be a top-down solution. When we think about climate change, it is impacting on typically people who are already living in very, very, very difficult situations, people in rural areas.
And who contribute the least
the very
to that
least,
problem.
And who also are the ones who are providing us with food sustainability on the continent.
And food security is also a big one, and I want us to discuss that. But Sophie, before we take our viewers to a quick break and then come back, we're also monitoring, of course, a number of developments, as I indicated before that. I mean, having listened to the United Nations Secretary General yesterday, and coming out very strongly in terms of time's up, you need to have political will as world leaders. How much do you think of the United Nations efforts and also their rhetoric and statements that they've been making have contributed to some of these world powers coming to South Africa, but also adopting the declaration?
I think it was a blessing for the UN chief in disguise, in a sense that he had a friend in South Africa. South Africa has always respected multilateralism, and therefore whoever is at the helm of that organization, the global organization, the United Nations, South Africa always make sure that they give support to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And therefore, they did listen to what Antonio Guterres has been saying, because this was in line with the concerns of the developing countries, the poorer nations, your developing South, including the Sub-Sahara, and South Africa being part of Sub-Sahara. Therefore, there was synergy. what he said yesterday, everything is captured in this declaration.
Yeah.
He got a lot. And I think those who will speak to the SG after the summit at the UN perhaps, or wherever he's going to be, he will touch on the outcomes of this G20. You will hear a tone of someone who is happy that there was movement on many issues, and cementing and affirming multilateralism, because then you are able to look at the financial system transformation and the Security Council transformation. So I think for the SG, this was a good gift ahead of his retirement next year.